Welcome to this biographical sleep story about Johannes Kepler, one of history's most brilliant and persevering minds. Tonight, we journey through the extraordinary life of the man who unlocked the mathematical secrets of planetary motion, transforming our understanding of the cosmos forever. Born into poverty and hardship in 16th-century Germany, Kepler rose from the humblest beginnings to become Imperial Mathematician to the Holy Roman Emperor. He became not just a revolutionary scientist, but a symbol of the power of human reason to penetrate nature's deepest mysteries. Through wars, plague, religious persecution, and devastating personal tragedies, he never abandoned his quest to understand the divine architecture of the heavens. As you settle into comfort and prepare for rest, let this story of cosmic discovery and human resilience carry you through the night. We'll explore his childhood struggles, his theological dreams that led to mathematical genius, his tumultuous partnership with the great Tycho Brahe, and the three immortal laws of planetary motion that bear his name. This is a story about faith and reason, about finding harmony in the heavens while chaos reigned on earth, and about a mind that refused to see the universe as anything less than a divine mathematical masterpiece. Chapter 1. The Early Years in Weil-der-Stadt. On December 27, 1571, in the small German town of Weil-der-Stadt, a sickly, premature infant entered the world. Johannes Kepler's arrival seemed inauspicious. His father, Heinrich Kepler, was a mercenary soldier of uncertain fortune and even more uncertain character, a man who would eventually abandon his family entirely. His mother, Katharina Guldenmann, was the daughter of an innkeeper, a woman who would later face accusations that would test his son's devotion in unimaginable ways. The Kepler family existed on the margins of respectable society, struggling with poverty that gnawed at them constantly. Young Johannes was a frail child, prone to illness and physical weakness. He nearly died of smallpox at age 4, an ordeal that left his hands crippled and his eyesight permanently damaged. For a boy who would grow up to spend countless hours performing intricate astronomical calculations and making delicate observations, these handicaps seemed cruel twists of fate. Yet perhaps it was precisely this physical frailty that drove his mind to such extraordinary heights. Unable to engage in the rough physical play of other children, Johannes turned inward, to books and numbers and the life of the mind. The Kepler household was chaotic and often violent. Heinrich's temper was legendary, and his absences grew longer and more frequent as Johannes grew older. Katharina, intelligent but eccentric, filled her son's head with tales and folklore, including knowledge of herbs and healing that would one day nearly cost her her life. The family's poverty was grinding and relentless. At times, young Johannes had to work in his grandfather's inn, serving customers and cleaning when he should have been in school. But even in this unpromising environment, sparks of genius began to show. Johannes displayed an extraordinary aptitude for mathematics. His teachers at the local Latin school recognized something special in this sickly, awkward boy. He absorbed knowledge with a hunger that amazed them. Numbers spoke to him in ways that seemed almost mystical. By the time he was a young teenager, it was clear that Johannes Kepler possessed a mind of unusual power and originality. The question became what to do with such a mind. The Kepler family had no means to support higher education. They lived hand to mouth, constantly on the edge of destitution. But in the Lutheran territories of southern Germany, there existed a remarkable system of scholarships for promising poor boys who might become pastors. The church needed educated clergy, and it was willing to invest in intelligent young men from humble backgrounds. For Johannes, this represented the only possible escape from a life of poverty and obscurity. When Johannes was 6 years old, his father took him outside one clear night to observe a great comet blazing across the sky. The boy stared upward, transfixed by the spectacle, the celestial visitor that seemed to have descended from another realm. 3 years later, his mother brought him out to witness a lunar eclipse, and young Johannes watched in wonder as the Earth's shadow slowly consumed the moon. These moments planted seeds in his imagination. The heavens were not merely decoration. They were a puzzle, a mystery, a divine text written in light and motion across the darkness. Life in Weil der Stadt grew increasingly difficult. Heinrich Kepler's absences became permanent. He left to fight as a mercenary in the Netherlands and never returned, likely dying in some forgotten battle far from home. Katharina struggled to keep the family together. Johannes continued his education through the charity of the Lutheran Church, knowing that his sharp mind was his only hope for survival. The boy who had been born too early, too weak, too poor, began to dream of understanding the cosmos itself. Chapter 2. The Seminary Student. At the age of 13, having distinguished himself in local schools, Johannes Kepler entered the Lower Seminary at Heidelberg. This was his gateway to higher education, his escape from poverty, and his preparation for a life in the Lutheran ministry. The seminary system was rigorous and demanding. Students rose before dawn for prayers, studied classical languages, theology, philosophy, and mathematics, and lived under strict monastic discipline. For most boys, it was a trial to be endured. For Johannes, it was liberation. Kepler proved himself a brilliant student, though not always a popular one. He was socially awkward, physically weak, and intellectually arrogant. He knew he was smarter than his classmates, and he didn't always hide it well. His journals from this period reveal a young man of fierce ambition and equally fierce self-doubt. He analyzed his own character with brutal honesty, noting his vanity, his desire for recognition, his tendency toward anger and resentment. Yet he also recorded his genuine love of learning, his sense of wonder at the natural world, and his deep desire to understand God's creation. After 3 years at Heidelberg, Kepler moved on to the higher seminary at Maulbronn, and then to the University of Tübingen, the crown jewel of Lutheran education. At Tübingen, he was meant to complete his theological training and become a pastor. It seemed his destiny was settled. But at Tübingen, Johannes Kepler encountered 2 things that would change the course of his life and the course of human knowledge. The first was the Copernican theory of the cosmos. In 1543, Nicholas Copernicus had published his revolutionary claim that the Earth and other planets orbited the Sun, not the other way around. This heliocentric theory contradicted both common sense and religious doctrine. Most scholars dismissed it as an interesting mathematical fiction, useful for calculations perhaps, but not a description of physical reality. At Tübingen, however, Kepler studied under Michael Maestlin, one of the few astronomers who believed Copernicus had discovered the truth. Maestlin taught the geocentric Ptolemaic system in his public lectures, as was required, but in private tutorials with his best students, he revealed the elegant simplicity of the Copernican system. For Kepler, it was a revelation. The heliocentric model made sense of the planetary motions with beautiful mathematical clarity. It explained why Venus and Mercury stayed close to the Sun, why Mars and Jupiter and Saturn sometimes appeared to move backward in the sky. Everything fit together with a harmony that seemed too perfect to be coincidence. This, Kepler became convinced, was how God had actually constructed the universe. The second transformative encounter was with mathematics itself, particularly geometry. Kepler became obsessed with the mathematical relationships he found in nature. He saw the world as a text written in the language of mathematics, a divine code waiting to be deciphered. The 5 regular solids of geometry, the Platonic solids, held particular fascination for him. These perfect three-dimensional shapes, the tetrahedron, cube, octahedron, dodecahedron, and icosahedron, seemed to him echoes of divine perfection. Kepler's theological studies continued, but his heart was increasingly drawn to astronomy and mathematics. He saw no contradiction between science and faith. Rather, he believed that by understanding the mathematical laws governing the cosmos, he was reading the mind of God, understanding the divine blueprint of creation. The heavens declared the glory of God, and Kepler wanted to understand the language in which that declaration was written. His professors recognized his extraordinary mathematical talent, even as they worried about his unorthodox theological views. Kepler had a restless, questioning mind that sometimes strayed into dangerous territory. He disagreed with certain Lutheran doctrines, particularly regarding the Eucharist. Such disagreements could be dangerous in an age of religious warfare. But his brilliance was undeniable, and in 1594, when the Protestant school in Graz, Austria, needed a mathematics teacher, Kepler's professors recommended their difficult, brilliant student. At 22 years old, Johannes Kepler left Tübingen without completing his theological degree. He would never become a pastor. Instead, he journeyed to Graz to teach mathematics and astronomy to students who had little interest in either subject. It must have seemed like exile, like a detour from his true calling. But this apparent setback would prove to be the beginning of his life's great work. The boy who had gazed at comets and eclipses was about to revolutionize humanity's understanding of how those celestial bodies moved through space. Chapter 3, The Teacher in Graz. Graz was a Catholic city in the midst of the Counter-Reformation, but its Protestant school clung to existence, serving the children of Lutheran merchants and minor nobility. Johannes Kepler arrived in April 1594 to take up his position as teacher of mathematics and astronomy. He was also expected to create astrological calendars predicting weather and political events for the coming year. For a man of Kepler's mathematical sophistication, creating astrological predictions must have seemed beneath him, yet he needed the income. His salary as a teacher was modest, and astrology paid. His first year of teaching was discouraging. Only a handful of students attended his mathematics lectures. His astronomy classes attracted even fewer. Kepler was not a natural teacher. He was too intense, too absorbed in his own thoughts, too impatient with students who couldn't follow his leaps of logic. He filled his private hours with calculation and contemplation, searching for the hidden mathematical patterns that he believed must govern the cosmos. Then, on July 19, 1595, while drawing a geometric figure on a blackboard for his handful of students, Johannes Kepler experienced what he would later describe as a divine revelation. He was illustrating how an equilateral triangle could be inscribed in a circle and circumscribed around another circle. As he drew, a thought struck him with the force of prophecy. What if the orbits of the planets were related to each other through geometric shapes? Kepler knew that there were 6 known planets: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. That meant 5 intervals between their orbits, and there were exactly 5 platonic solids, the perfect 3-dimensional geometric forms. Could this be the answer? Could the spacing of the planets be determined by nesting these solids inside spheres? A cube inside a sphere, inside a tetrahedron, inside another sphere, and so on? He rushed home and began calculating feverishly. He tried different arrangements of the solids, checking them against the known planetary distances. The match wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to convince him that he had discovered the fundamental architecture of the solar system. God, the divine geometer, had used these perfect shapes to determine where each planet should orbit. The cosmos was not random. It was a mathematical masterpiece, and Kepler had glimpsed the blueprint. With an enthusiasm bordering on mania, Kepler threw himself into writing a book explaining his discovery. He called it Mysterium Cosmographicum, the cosmographic mystery. In its pages, he presented his geometric model of the solar system, argued passionately for the Copernican heliocentric theory, and revealed his vision of a cosmos governed by mathematical harmony. He was 25 years old, and he believed he had solved the greatest puzzle in natural philosophy. The book was published in 1596, and it made Kepler's reputation, at least among astronomers and mathematicians who mattered. Most readers rejected his geometric model, but they couldn't deny the brilliance of the mathematical reasoning or the boldness of the vision. Kepler sent copies to the great astronomers of Europe. Most importantly, he sent one to Tycho Brahe, the most famous observational astronomer alive, a Danish nobleman who possessed the most accurate astronomical observations ever made. Tycho sent back a polite but measured response. He praised Kepler's ingenuity but disagreed with the Copernican model. Tycho had his own theory, with the planets orbiting the sun but the sun orbiting the Earth. Still, Tycho recognized talent when he saw it. He suggested that if Kepler wanted to prove his theories, he would need better data. Tycho had that data. The correspondence between the young mathematical genius and the aging observational master had begun. Meanwhile, Kepler's personal life took an unexpected turn. In 1597, he married Barbara Müller, a twice-widowed daughter of a wealthy mill owner. The marriage was arranged more for financial security than love. Barbara was practical and conventional, with little interest in her husband's mathematical obsessions. They would have 5 children together, though only 2 would survive to adulthood. The marriage was often strained. Kepler confided to friends that Barbara didn't understand him, that he felt lonely even in his own home. In Graz, the political situation for Protestants was deteriorating. The Counter-Reformation was tightening its grip. In 1598, the Catholic Archduke Ferdinand ordered all Protestant teachers and preachers to leave Graz. Kepler was expelled from the city. He was eventually allowed to return after negotiations, but the message was clear. His time in Graz was running out. He needed to find a new position, a new patron, a place where he could continue his work. Tycho Brahe, now serving as Imperial Mathematician to Rudolf II in Prague, sent word. He needed talented mathematicians to help him with his astronomical work. He offered Kepler a position as his assistant. It was a momentous decision. Kepler knew that working with Tycho meant access to decades of precise astronomical observations, the best data in the world. It also meant leaving everything familiar, traveling to a strange city, and subordinating himself to a man famous for his fierce ego and demanding nature. But what choice did he have? The persecution in Graz was intensifying. In January 1600, Johannes Kepler, his wife, and his stepdaughter began the long journey to Prague. Chapter 4. Meeting Tycho Brahe. Johannes Kepler arrived in Prague in February 1600, his few possessions packed in a wagon, his pregnant wife exhausted from the journey, his future uncertain. Prague was the seat of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, a strange and melancholic monarch who cared little for politics but passionately supported alchemy, astrology, and the arts. The city was a magnet for scholars, mystics, and charlatans of every description. In this atmosphere of intellectual ferment and political intrigue, Tycho Brahe held court. Tycho lived and worked at Benátky Castle, about 20 miles from Prague. When Kepler first met him, he encountered a man as different from himself as could be imagined. Tycho was a Danish nobleman, wealthy and aristocratic, with a famous temper and an even more famous prosthetic nose, made of brass, that replaced the one he had lost in a duel as a young man. He drank heavily, entertained lavishly, and ruled his assistants with an iron hand. His astronomical observations were legendary, the product of decades of painstaking nightly work with massive instruments he had designed himself. The relationship between Tycho and Kepler was fraught from the beginning. Tycho needed Kepler's mathematical brilliance to make sense of his mountain of observational data. Kepler desperately needed Tycho's observations to test and refine his theories, but Tycho was possessive of his data, doling it out in small portions, fearful that Kepler or another assistant might steal his life's work and publish it under their own name. Kepler, for his part, found Tycho's grand lifestyle wasteful and his reluctance to share data maddening. Tycho assigned Kepler to work on the orbit of Mars. This was meant to be a temporary task, something to keep the impatient young mathematician occupied. Mars was a problem. It wandered in the sky in ways that didn't quite fit the circular orbits that everyone assumed planets followed. Neither Ptolemy's geocentric model nor Copernicus's heliocentric model could accurately predict where Mars would appear in the sky. Tycho's precise observations had made the problem impossible to ignore. Kepler threw himself into the problem with characteristic intensity. He assumed it would take him a few weeks to solve. It would consume 8 years of his life and lead to one of the greatest scientific discoveries in history. But in those early months at Benátky Castle, he was simply frustrated. Tycho would give him a few observations, then withhold others. The two men argued constantly. Kepler's letters from this period are filled with complaints about Tycho's treatment of him and worries about money. By April 1600, tensions had reached a breaking point. After a particularly bitter argument, Kepler left Benátky and returned to Prague, threatening to go back to Germany. For weeks, he and Tycho exchanged angry letters. Tycho offered limited concessions. Kepler made demands. Both men knew they needed each other, but neither wanted to admit it. Eventually, with the mediation of friends and the emperor's officials, a reconciliation was arranged. Kepler returned to Benátky with a better salary and clearer terms of employment. The collaboration resumed, still tense but productive. Kepler began to appreciate the extraordinary quality of Tycho's observations. These measurements were accurate to within 1 or 2 minutes of arc, an astonishing achievement for naked-eye astronomy. Such precision meant that any theory had to match the observations almost exactly, or it was wrong. There was no room for fudging the numbers or claiming that discrepancies didn't matter. Tycho's data was both a gift and a challenge. In September 1601, after a feast held at the home of a patron, Tycho Brahe fell violently ill. The exact cause remains disputed by historians. Some accounts suggest a bladder infection, others hint at poison. For 11 days, Tycho suffered in agony, his bladder failing, his body racked with fever. Johannes Kepler visited him as he lay dying. According to Kepler's account, Tycho's final words to him were a plea. "Don't let my life's work be in vain," he begged. "Complete the work, prove the theories." Tycho Brahe died on October 24, 1601. 2 days later, Johannes Kepler was appointed Imperial Mathematician to Rudolf II, inheriting Tycho's position and, more importantly, gaining full access to Tycho's decades of astronomical observations. Kepler immediately seized the data and began working on it before Tycho's heirs could claim it. It was a morally questionable act, but Kepler justified it to himself. Tycho had wanted the work completed, and only Kepler had the mathematical skill to do it. Now, at the age of 30, Johannes Kepler possessed the two things he needed to revolutionize astronomy. He had mathematical genius and physical intuition, and he had the most accurate astronomical data ever collected. The problem of Mars waited for him, more challenging than he had ever imagined. But in solving it, he would discover truths about the cosmos that would endure for centuries. The real work was about to begin. Chapter 5: The Imperial Mathematician. As Imperial Mathematician, Johannes Kepler's primary responsibility was to complete Tycho's unfinished work, the Rudolphine Tables, a comprehensive set of astronomical tables for predicting planetary positions. He was also expected to cast horoscopes for the emperor, make astrological predictions, and advise on calendrical matters. The salary was irregular and often unpaid. Rudolf II's treasury was perpetually empty, and Kepler spent much of his time begging for his wages. But he had the data, and he had time. He began his assault on Mars. The conventional wisdom was that planets moved in perfect circles at constant speeds. Circles were divine, perfect, eternal. Aristotle had taught it. Ptolemy had elaborated it. Even Copernicus, revolutionary in placing the sun at the center, had retained circular orbits. But Tycho's observations of Mars refused to fit a circular orbit, no matter how Kepler manipulated the mathematics. The planet was always slightly off from where a circular orbit predicted it should be. Only by 8 minutes of arc, a tiny amount, but Tycho's observations were accurate enough that those 8 minutes could not be ignored. For years, Kepler tried every mathematical trick he knew. He adjusted the size of the circle. He offset the center. He added epicycles, small circles rolling on larger circles, as Ptolemy had done. He tried combining multiple circles in different configurations. Nothing worked. The observations and the circles refused to agree. Kepler's frustration grew. He performed calculation after calculation, filling page after page with numbers, searching for the pattern that would make everything fit. Then Kepler made a conceptual breakthrough that would have been unthinkable to earlier astronomers. What if the planets didn't move at constant speed? What if they moved faster when closer to the sun and slower when farther away? Kepler began to think of the sun not just as the geometric center of the solar system, but as a physical force pushing or pulling the planets. He imagined rays of force emanating from the sun, weakening with distance, driving the planets along their paths. This physical intuition led him to a mathematical relationship. He discovered that if you drew a line from the sun to Mars, that line would sweep out equal areas in equal times as Mars orbited. When Mars was close to the sun, it moved faster through space, but the triangle formed by its motion was fat and short. When Mars was far from the sun, it moved slower, but the triangle was long and thin. The areas were equal. This would become Kepler's second law of planetary motion, though he discovered it before what we now call his first law. But the orbit itself remained a mystery. Kepler tried egg shapes, ovals, and various deformed circles. He spent months working with a shape he called the via buccosa, the puffy-cheeked orbit, which had slight bulges. Nothing matched Tycho's data well enough. By 1604, Kepler had been working on Mars for 4 years, had performed thousands of calculations, and was no closer to a solution. Meanwhile, his personal life was shadowed by tragedy. In 1602, his 6-year-old son Heinrich died. In 1605, his infant son Friedrich died. Plague swept through Prague repeatedly. Religious and political tensions were escalating across the Holy Roman Empire. The precarious tolerance that had allowed Protestants like Kepler to work in Catholic Prague was eroding. Kepler's own religious views had become so heterodox that neither Lutherans nor Catholics fully accepted him. But he continued calculating, driven by an obsession that seemed almost mad. Then, in the spring of 1605, in a moment that he would later describe with almost religious awe, the answer came to him. What if the orbit of Mars wasn't a circle at all? What if it was an ellipse? An ellipse, a flattened circle with 2 focal points instead of 1 center, was a well-known geometric shape. But no one had ever imagined that the divine creator would use such an imperfect form for the heavens. Kepler placed the sun at one focus of the ellipse and calculated where Mars should appear at various times. The mathematics was complex, requiring techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was possible before the invention of calculus. But when he compared his calculations to Tycho's observations, they matched perfectly. Every observation, every position of Mars in the sky, agreed with the elliptical orbit to within the accuracy of the measurements. After 8 years of struggle, Kepler had solved the problem. This was Kepler's first law of planetary motion. Planets orbit the sun in ellipses, not circles, with the sun at one focus. Combined with his second law about equal areas and equal times, Kepler had fundamentally transformed astronomy. The universe was not built on perfect circles. It was built on ellipses. The divine geometer used more sophisticated mathematics than anyone had imagined. Kepler saw this not as a diminishment of God's perfection, but as a revelation of deeper mathematical beauty. He spent the next 4 years writing Astronomia Nova, the New Astronomy, presenting his discoveries to the world. Published in 1609, it was a revolutionary book, not just for its conclusions, but for its method. Kepler showed his work. He described his false starts, his mistakes, his reasoning process. He invited readers to follow his mathematical journey, and he argued passionately that these were not mere computational tricks, but descriptions of how the planets actually move through physical space. Chapter 6. The New Astronomy. The publication of Astronomia Nova in 1609 should have been Johannes Kepler's moment of triumph. He had solved a problem that had defeated astronomers for millennia. He had revealed the true paths of the planets. but the book's reception was muted. Most astronomers couldn't follow his complex mathematics. Others rejected his ellipses on philosophical grounds. How could God create an imperfect universe? The epicycles and circles of the old system at least had the virtue of symmetry and tradition. Kepler was disappointed but not deterred. He knew he was right. Tycho's observations proved it. Anyone willing to do the calculations would see. Meanwhile, he had other projects demanding his attention. The Rudolphine tables remained incomplete. The emperor still wanted horoscopes, and Kepler's financial situation was increasingly desperate. Rudolph II's court was collapsing into chaos. The emperor, never mentally stable, was losing his grip on power. Wages went unpaid for months. In 16011, tragedy struck Kepler's family with devastating force. His 6-year-old son, Friedrich, died, likely of smallpox. A few weeks later, his wife Barbara succumbed to fever, possibly typhus or Hungarian spotted fever. Within a single terrible year, Kepler lost 2 children and his wife. He was left with 2 surviving children to care for, a demanding job with no pay, and a city descending into political violence as rival factions fought over who would succeed Rudolf. Rudolf II died in 1612, replaced by his brother Matthias. Kepler kept his position as Imperial Mathematician, but Prague was no longer safe or welcoming for him. He began looking for other opportunities. He corresponded with universities and noble patrons across Europe, seeking a position that would provide stable income and freedom to continue his research. His reputation was growing among those who understood his work, even if popular acclaim eluded him. In 1613, Kepler remarried. His new wife was Susanna Reutinger, the 24-year-old daughter of a cabinet maker. Kepler's account of choosing her is both touching and oddly calculating. He interviewed 11 potential brides, analyzing their virtues and drawbacks in his journal like a mathematical problem. He settled on Susanna not because she was the richest or most beautiful, but because he felt genuine affection for her and believed she would be a good companion. The marriage proved happy and produced 6 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. That same year, he moved his family to Linz, Austria, where he had been offered the position of provincial mathematician. Linz was smaller and less cosmopolitan than Prague, but it offered stability, or so Kepler hoped. He settled into his new life, teaching, making astronomical calculations, and continuing the work on the Rudolphine tables. But he couldn't leave the cosmos alone. His mind was already reaching toward the next great problem. Kepler had discovered how planets moved, but he still wanted to know why they moved that way. Why were the planetary orbits spaced as they were? Why did they take the time they did to complete their orbits? His youthful theory about nested platonic solids had proven inadequate. The fit wasn't precise enough. But Kepler remained convinced that mathematical harmony governed the heavens, that there was a pattern waiting to be discovered. He began investigating the relationship between a planet's distance from the sun and the time it took to complete an orbit. He knew from his own second law that planets closer to the sun moved faster and took less time to orbit. But what was the exact mathematical relationship? For years, he tried different formulas, different ratios, different combinations of planetary distances and orbital periods. Then, on May 15, 1618, Kepler experienced another of his mathematical epiphanies. He discovered that the square of a planet's orbital period was proportional to the cube of its average distance from the sun. If you took the time a planet needed to orbit the sun, multiplied that number by itself, and then divided by the cube of the planet's distance from the sun, you got the same number for every planet. Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, all followed the same mathematical law. This was Kepler's third law of planetary motion, and to him it was the most beautiful of all. It revealed a deep mathematical harmony in the cosmos, a harmony that transcended individual planets and connected the entire solar system in one elegant relationship. Kepler was ecstatic. He had found the music of the spheres, not as sound, but as mathematical proportion. He immediately began work on a new book, Harmonices Mundi, The Harmony of the World. Published in 1619, it was Kepler's most ambitious work, blending astronomy, geometry, music theory, and philosophy. In its pages, he presented his third law, but also his theories about the mathematical ratios underlying musical harmony, the geometric patterns in snowflakes, and the fundamental structure of reality. It was part scientific treatise, part mystical vision, entirely characteristic of Kepler's unique mind. Many sections of Harmonices Mundi seem strange to modern readers. Kepler assigned musical notes to the planets based on their speeds at different points in their orbits. He drew connections between geometric shapes and consonant musical intervals. He saw mathematical patterns everywhere and insisted they were evidence of divine design. But embedded in all this mysticism was hard, brilliant science. The third law was real, and it would eventually help Isaac Newton formulate his law of universal gravitation. Chapter 7. The Harmony of the World. For Johannes Kepler, the publication of Harmonices Mundi represented the culmination of a lifetime's quest. He had begun his career with the geometric vision in Mysterium Cosmographicum, the dream that God had structured the universe according to mathematical principles. Now, more than 20 years later, he had discovered the mathematical harmonies that actually governed planetary motion. The three laws, elliptical orbits, equal areas in equal times, and the relationship between orbital period and distance formed a complete description of how the solar system worked. But understanding the cosmos did not bring peace to Kepler's earthly life. The Europe he lived in was tearing itself apart. The 30 Years' War had begun in 1618, initially a conflict between Protestant and Catholic states in the Holy Roman Empire, but soon engulfing the entire continent. Armies marched back and forth across Germany and Austria, leaving destruction in their wake. Religious tolerance evaporated. Cities that had accommodated both faiths now demanded conformity. In Linz, Kepler found himself increasingly isolated. His refusal to fully embrace Lutheran orthodoxy meant he was denied communion by the local Lutheran church. They considered his views on the Eucharist heretical. Kepler argued and pleaded for understanding, but the pastors were inflexible. Here was the Imperial Mathematician, famous across Europe, excluded from his own church. The irony was bitter. He had fled Catholic persecution only to face Protestant rejection. Meanwhile, Kepler's scientific work continued. He published studies on optics, explaining how telescopes worked and how the eye formed images. He wrote about the nature of light, the causes of refraction, and the properties of lenses. When Galileo turned his telescope toward the heavens and discovered the moons of Jupiter, it was Kepler who provided the mathematical framework to understand what those observations meant. The two men corresponded, though they never met. Kepler supported Galileo's discoveries enthusiastically, seeing them as confirmation of the Copernican system. Kepler also wrote an extraordinary little book called Somnium, the Dream, one of the first works of science fiction. In it, he imagined a journey to the moon and described what the heavens would look like from that vantage point. He used the fictional journey to explore real astronomical phenomena, explaining the phases of Earth as seen from the moon, the appearance of the stars, and the nature of the lunar environment. But Somnium also revealed Kepler's fascination with his mother's knowledge of herbs and healing, knowledge that would soon bring disaster to his family. The war came closer to Linz. In 1620, Catholic forces laid siege to the city. Kepler and his family huddled in their home as cannons thundered and the city burned. When the Catholics finally captured Linz, Kepler feared for his life, but his reputation protected him. Even Catholic authorities recognized the value of the Imperial Mathematician. He was allowed to stay, though the atmosphere grew increasingly hostile to Protestants. Through all this chaos, Kepler continued working on the Rudolphine tables, the comprehensive astronomical tables he had promised to complete decades earlier. It was tedious, painstaking work, requiring thousands of calculations to predict the positions of planets, the sun, the moon, and stars for years into the future. Kepler performed much of the mathematical labor himself, assisted by a few collaborators. The work was exhausting and often thankless, but Kepler saw it as his duty. He had promised Tycho Brahe on his deathbed. In 1626, after years of delays caused by war, financial problems, and technical difficulties with printing, the Rudolphine tables were finally published. They were dedicated to Emperor Ferdinand II and represented the most accurate astronomical tables ever created. For decades afterward, astronomers and navigators used them to predict planetary positions, eclipses, and transits. The tables were a monument to both Tycho's observations and Kepler's mathematical genius. But even as Kepler completed this crowning achievement, personal tragedy was unfolding once again. His mother, Katharina Kepler, now an elderly woman living in the town of Leonberg, faced accusations of witchcraft. The charges were absurd, born of small-town grudges and superstition. Katharina knew about herbs and healing. She was argumentative and odd. In the paranoid atmosphere of the witch trials that were consuming parts of Germany, that was enough. She was arrested and thrown into prison. Johannes Kepler received the news in Linz and was horrified. His mother faced torture and execution. The evidence against her was laughable, consisting of gossip, personal feuds, and the accusations of neighbors who claimed she had caused illnesses with her potions and curses. But witch trials didn't require evidence by any rational standard. They required confession, often extracted through torture, and then came burning. Kepler abandoned his work and traveled to Leonberg to defend his mother. He was the Imperial Mathematician, one of the most famous scholars in Europe, and he would use every ounce of his intelligence and influence to save her. For more than a year, Kepler fought the accusation, writing legal briefs, arguing in court, appealing to authorities. It consumed him completely, this battle against ignorance and cruelty. And in the end, he won, though barely. Chapter 8. Personal Tragedies. The witch trial of Katharina Kepler dragged on for 6 years, from 1615 to 1621, though Johannes didn't become directly involved until 1620. The accusations were a toxic mix of the mundane and the bizarre. An old woman who'd quarreled with Katharina claimed the elder Kepler had given her a potion that caused illness. A tailor said his wife had suffered mysterious pains after Katharina touched her. Neighbors testified that her children had died young, surely a sign of witchcraft, conveniently forgetting that infant mortality was common. Katharina was held in prison under appalling conditions while the legal proceedings crept forward. The court wanted her confession. In witch trials, torture was commonly used to extract confessions, and even the threat of showing the instruments of torture to the accused was often enough to break their will. But Johannes Kepler was stubborn. She maintained her innocence. She refused to confess to crimes she hadn't committed, even when shown the rack and thumbscrews. Johannes Kepler marshaled every resource he possessed to save his mother. He wrote detailed legal arguments demolishing the prosecution's case. He pointed out inconsistencies in testimony. He called upon his connections to princes and nobles. He argued that the accusations were based on personal grudges and superstition, not evidence. His mathematical mind, trained to distinguish truth from error through rigorous logic, dissected the case against his mother with devastating precision. The legal authorities were in a difficult position. They faced a famous scholar arguing forcefully for his mother's innocence, but they also faced a populace convinced of Katharina's guilt and eager for a witch burning. The trial became a test of whether reason and law could prevail over fear and superstition. For month after agonizing month, Kepler fought, while his mother languished in prison, her health deteriorating. Finally, in October 1621, the court reached a decision. Johannes Kepler was formally acquitted of all charges of witchcraft, but there was a cruel caveat. She was brought before the instruments of torture one final time and asked if she maintained her innocence. If she confessed now, the court hinted, she might be shown mercy. Katharina, frail and broken by imprisonment but undefeated in spirit, declared her innocence once more. The court had no choice but to release her. Johannes Kepler died 6 months later in April 1622, her health ruined by the ordeal of imprisonment and trial. She was 75 years old. Johannes had saved her from execution, but the cost was terrible. He had spent months away from his work. He had exhausted himself emotionally and financially, and in the end, he could only buy his mother a few more months of freedom before death claimed her anyway. The witch trial left Kepler shaken. It reminded him of the irrationality and cruelty that lay beneath the surface of civilized society. Here he was, a man who had explained the movements of the heavens, who had revealed mathematical laws governing the cosmos, and yet he lived in a world where old women could be tortured and killed based on gossip and superstition. The contrast between the ordered beauty of the heavens and the chaotic brutality of human affairs must have seemed almost unbearable. Meanwhile, the 30 Years' War ground on, growing more destructive with each passing year. What had begun as a religious conflict had become a general European war, with Sweden, France, Spain, and other powers sending armies to fight on German soil. The Holy Roman Empire was devastated. Entire regions were depopulated. Famine and plague followed the armies. The world Kepler had known in his youth was being destroyed. In Linz, Kepler's position became untenable. The Counter-Reformation was intensifying. Catholic authorities pressured Protestant scholars to convert or leave. Kepler, who had been denied communion by his own Lutheran church for doctrinal disagreements, was now also unwelcome to Catholics. He was a man without a religious home, suspect to both sides in the great conflict tearing Europe apart. In 1626, after publishing the Rudolphine tables, Kepler left Linz. He took his family to Ulm for the printing, then moved to Regensburg, seeking a new patron. He tried to settle in Sagan in Silesia under the patronage of the Duke of Wallenstein, a powerful general in the imperial army who had an interest in astrology. Kepler cast horoscopes for Wallenstein, work he found tedious and intellectually degrading, but he needed the money. These final years were marked by constant travel, financial desperation, and declining health. The imperial treasury owed Kepler enormous sums in back wages, but collecting was nearly impossible. The empire's finances were in chaos. Kepler traveled from city to city, petitioning officials, trying to collect what he was owed, seeking any stable position. He was 58 years old, exhausted, suffering from chronic fevers, still working on astronomical problems between the endless journeys. In the fall of 1630, Kepler traveled to Regensburg to petition the imperial diet for his back wages. On the journey, he fell seriously ill with fever. He reached Regensburg but collapsed soon after arrival. For a few days, he lingered, fevered and delirious. On November 15th, 1630, Johannes Kepler died. He was 58 years old. The man who had explained the heavens died in a rented room, far from home, still owed thousands of florins by an empire that had failed him. Chapter 9. The Witch Trial. The witch trial of Johannes Kepler's mother deserves deeper examination, for it reveals not only the personal tragedy of Katharina Kepler, but also the collision between rational inquiry and superstitious terror that characterized Kepler's age. The trial began in 1615 when Ursula Reinbold, a woman Katharina had known for years, fell ill after drinking a potion Katharina had prepared. Ursula claimed the potion had been cursed, that Katharina was a witch who had tried to kill her. The accusation spread through Leonberg like wildfire. Other supposed victims came forward. A glazier's wife said Katharina had touched her, and immediately afterward she had suffered pains in her arm. A butcher testified that his children had died after quarreling with Katharina. The gravedigger claimed Katharina had asked for his father's skull, surely for use in dark rituals. Each piece of gossip and coincidence was woven into a narrative of demonic pact and malevolent magic. The timing was catastrophically bad. Germany in the early 17th century was in the grip of witch trial mania. Between 1580 and 1630, tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were executed for witchcraft in the German-speaking lands. The trials fed on fear, religious anxiety, and social tensions. Any woman who was old, poor, quarrelsome, or simply unlucky could find herself accused. Katharina Kepler, with her knowledge of herbs and her sharp tongue, was an ideal target. In August 1620, when Johannes Kepler arrived in Leonberg to defend his mother, she had already been imprisoned for months. The conditions were medieval in their cruelty. She was confined to a small cell, chained, given minimal food. The legal process was designed to extract confession, not to determine innocence or guilt. Torture was routine, and once a confession was obtained, burning at the stake followed swiftly. Kepler approached his mother's defense with the same methodical rigor he brought to astronomical problems. He studied the accusations line by line, identifying contradictions and absurdities. Ursula Reinbold's illness. She had recovered, so hardly evidence of a murderous curse. The glazier's wife's arm pain? Coincidence, or perhaps arthritis. The butcher's children's deaths. Infant mortality was common. No witchcraft required. The skull request? A misunderstanding or fabrication. He prepared a lengthy legal document, the defension, defending his mother point by point. He called upon his status as Imperial Mathematician, reminding the court that he served the emperor himself and that his mother was therefore under imperial protection. He quoted legal precedents. He cited scripture. He argued that the accusations violated both reason and law. It was a masterpiece of legal reasoning, though it must have been agonizing to write, knowing his mother's life hung in the balance. The prosecutors pushed back. They brought in more witnesses. They suggested that Katharina's son's very interest in astronomy and mathematics might itself be evidence of trafficking with demons. After all, how else could a man from such humble origins have learned such arcane knowledge? Kepler must have felt the irony. His very genius, the product of his mind's extraordinary power, was being used as evidence against his mother. The case dragged into 1621. Katharina remained imprisoned, her health failing. The court scheduled a formal interrogation with torture. This was the critical moment. If Katharina broke under torture and confessed, she would be executed. If she maintained her innocence but the court decided to torture her further anyway, she might die from the torture itself. Kepler's legal maneuvering had delayed this moment for months, but now it had arrived. On September 28, 1621, 73-year-old Katharina Kepler was led into the torture chamber. The executioner and his assistants displayed the instruments, explaining in detail how each would be used to break her body and extract the truth. She was given one final chance to confess. According to the court records, Katharina looked at the instruments, looked at her tormentors, and said she would rather die than confess to lies. She commended her soul to God and told them to do what they would. It was an act of extraordinary courage. The old woman who had spent her life on the margins of society, who had seen her husband abandon her, who had raised her brilliant son in poverty, faced the tools of torture and refused to break. Her stubbornness, the same quality that had made her unpopular in Leonberg, now saved her life. The court was impressed by her steadfastness, or perhaps they were simply worn down by Kepler's legal arguments. Either way, they decided not to proceed with torture. On October 4th, 1621, Katharina Kepler was formally released from prison. The court declared that while suspicion remained, there was insufficient evidence to convict. It was not quite a full acquittal, but it was freedom. Katharina returned to Leonberg, broken in body, but vindicated. Johannes had saved her. His intelligence, his persistence, and his willingness to use every resource at his disposal had prevailed over fear and superstition. But it was a narrow victory, and it had cost him dearly. Chapter 10. Final Years and Legacy. After his mother's death in 1622, Johannes Kepler's final 8 years were a slow descent into obscurity and poverty, though his mind remained as sharp as ever. He had become a relic of an earlier age when Emperor Rudolf II's court had welcomed scholars and artists regardless of their religious affiliations. That tolerant world was gone, destroyed by the 30 Years' War. The new Europe had little place for a man like Kepler, too unorthodox for Lutherans, too Protestant for Catholics. In Linz, his position became increasingly untenable. The Counter-Reformation authorities wanted him gone. Finally, in 1626, Kepler resigned as provincial mathematician and moved his family to Ulm, where he supervised the printing of the Rudolphine tables. The publication was his last great achievement, the completion of the task Tycho Brahe had set him 3 decades earlier. The tables were immediately recognized as a masterwork far superior to any previous astronomical tables. From Ulm, Kepler moved to Sagan in Silesia, where he had secured the patronage of Albrecht von Wallenstein, one of the most powerful and controversial figures of the 30 Years' War. Wallenstein was a brilliant general, fantastically wealthy, politically ambitious, and deeply superstitious. He believed in astrology and wanted Kepler to cast his horoscope and predict his future. Kepler, who had always had a complicated relationship with astrology, complied. He needed the money. The horoscope Kepler prepared for Wallenstein was a masterpiece of diplomatic vagueness. He predicted that Wallenstein would face great dangers in 1634, but might survive them through prudence. In fact, Wallenstein was assassinated in 1634 by imperial agents who feared his growing power. Kepler's prediction seemed eerily accurate, though it was more psychological insight than supernatural foresight. Kepler understood ambitious men and the dangers they faced. In Sagan, Kepler continued his astronomical work. He published studies on chronology, attempting to determine the exact year of Christ's birth. He worked on logarithmic tables to aid calculation. He continued his correspondence with astronomers across Europe, sharing observations and ideas. Even as his circumstances deteriorated, his mind kept working, kept calculating, kept trying to understand the cosmos. His family life brought both joy and sorrow. His second wife, Susanna, was a loyal companion, but 3 of their children died in infancy or childhood. Disease and malnutrition were constant threats. Kepler himself suffered from recurring fevers and digestive problems. His eyesight, damaged by smallpox in childhood, continued to deteriorate. Yet he worked on, driven by an inner necessity that transcended comfort or recognition. The imperial treasury continued to owe Kepler enormous sums in unpaid wages. Over the years, the debt had grown to more than 12,000 florins, a fortune that would have secured his family's future. But the imperial finances were in chaos. The war consumed everything. Collecting what he was owed became Kepler's obsession. He traveled repeatedly to petition imperial officials, presenting his case, demanding payment. He was met with sympathy, but no money. In November 1630, Kepler made one final journey to Regensburg, where the imperial diet was meeting. He hoped to present his case directly to the assembled princes and officials. Perhaps this time he would finally receive the wages owed to him. The journey was long and difficult. Winter was coming, and Kepler was not a well man, but desperation drove him forward. He arrived in Regensburg exhausted and feverish. Within days, his condition worsened dramatically. Fever consumed him. He became delirious. A local Lutheran pastor visited him, offering to administer communion if Kepler would sign a statement of Orthodox Lutheran faith. Kepler, even on his deathbed, refused. He would not compromise his beliefs for comfort, not even now. The pastor left, and Kepler died without the last rites of his church. Johannes Kepler died on November 15, 1630, in a rented room in Regensburg. He was 58 years old. He was buried in the local cemetery with a simple funeral. The gravestone bore an epitaph he had written for himself. "I used to measure the heavens. Now I measure the shadows of earth. Although my soul was from heaven, the shadow of my body lies here." Years later, during the 30 Years' War, the cemetery was destroyed and Kepler's grave was lost. No trace of it remains. But Kepler's true monument is not a gravestone. It is the 3 laws of planetary motion that transformed astronomy and paved the way for Isaac Newton's law of universal gravitation. It is the Rudolphine tables that served astronomers for generations. It is the spirit of inquiry that refused to accept received wisdom and instead demanded that theories match observations precisely. Kepler showed that the cosmos operates according to mathematical laws that human reason can discover and understand. His life was marked by struggle, tragedy, and often bitter disappointment. He was never wealthy. He was rarely appreciated by his contemporaries at his true worth. He lived through war, plague, and religious persecution. He lost children, watched his mother endure a witch trial, and died in poverty far from home. Yet he persevered. He kept calculating, kept searching for patterns, kept trying to read the mind of God in the mathematics of creation. Johannes Kepler's legacy extends far beyond astronomy. He helped establish the principle that nature operates according to discoverable laws, that careful observation and mathematical reasoning can reveal truths about the universe. He showed that scientific progress often requires abandoning cherished assumptions, like the perfect circles of ancient astronomy. He demonstrated that science and religious faith need not be enemies, that understanding creation's laws can be a form of worship. Today, space telescopes bear his name. The Kepler Space Telescope discovered thousands of planets orbiting other stars, extending Kepler's work beyond our solar system to the vast universe beyond. His laws are taught to every student of physics and astronomy. His name stands alongside Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton among the founders of modern science. The sickly child from Weil der Stadt, who gazed at comets and eclipses, did indeed measure the heavens. And in doing so, he helped humanity understand its place in the cosmos.